The podcast topic for today is middle class and working class. More specifically, I'd like to explore what it actually means to be a middle class citizen here in America. But not just that, what does it even mean in the first place? If you watch news, any kind of entertainment, and most certainly politics, you will hear middle class used over and over and over. It doesn't matter which sphere of the political spectrum you're on, you will hear each and every one use middle class. They'll use it in a positive light, painting in how they're the demographic, and these are the ones who are going to be voting. But they'll also do it in a negative light. These are the individuals who are being crushed by jobs going overseas, or the middle class is being punished because the rich aren't paying taxes. So middle class is one of those words that is used all the time. And while I was doing research for something else, which when you go to the homepage of my website, that's exactly what it says. The very first word is research. While I was researching something else, and while I was reading another book to do a book review on, this idea about the middle class and what does it mean, and they gave some parameters for what the middle class is, it got me thinking. What does that look like today? How many Americans are middle class? And for that matter, what is the middle class anyway? What constitutes that? But we're going to take it a step further, because I want to talk also about what it means to be working class. The two are often interchanged in conversation. People will use one for the other sometimes. What kind of definition are we using? Is there more than one? And if so, which one do we use? And so, armed with my handy dandy piece of paper here, my sheet for just basic show notes, I also have a laptop in front of me open that is basically the draft item for this very podcast, but on article form. We're going to explore middle class versus working class. So let's get into it. First up, what does it even mean to be a middle class citizen? What does it mean? Now, there are two different definitions for a middle class citizen here in the country. Both of them are in the financial realm. The first one is countrywide. And as we explore countrywide, we take all of the jobs, all of the income, we bring it all together, and we say, okay, the numbers that a lot of economists feel are good to use are, do you make 2/3 of the nation's median income to twice the nation's median income? So if you are an individual, and the United States is a very large country. I think we're the third largest population in the world, right behind, China, and it's India actually, and then it's China, and then there's a severe drop off, and then it's the United States. But we take all of the people in this country and what they make before taxes, put it all together, and if you make 2/3 of that median income to twice that median income, then the first definition, which is countrywide, we would say you are middle class. Now, there are some people who will break it up into various, upper middle class, lower middle class, all that stuff. But if you make 2/3 of the nation's median income to twice what the nation's median income is, then from the countrywide parameter, you are middle class. Now, when you look at this, just that alone, there's a glaring problem with this. Somebody who is considered, quote, middle class in Tennessee is most certainly not going to be considered middle class in Chicago or New York or anywhere that there is a higher cost of living. Again, this is a very large country. So the reality then is that even though it's the easiest one to kind of put data in and to go, okay, well, look, if you make 2/3 to twice, then you're middle class, it doesn't really work overall. It doesn't give us it falls short, if you will, of giving us an accurate and true measure of what it means to really be middle class. And that's the first definition. But the second one is the one we're going to focus on, and it is a regional based one, meaning we're going to look at various areas. And fortunately, this link will be a hyperlink in the show note descriptions. But what it is a link to the Pew Research Center. There's a few things that I'm going to link in the description show notes that come from the Pew Research Center. But the first one that we're going to talk about today is their calculator. You go to their calculator and you tell them a few different parameters. Number one, what state you live in. And then they're going to ask you what metropolitan area you live in or live close to. They're going to ask you your income before taxes. And then lastly, they're going to ask you how many dependents you have. And when you put that into the calculator, it will tell you where you fit in on the spectrum of middle class or not. And it's a far easier way to track someone who's middle class because we keep it as close to where you're at as possible. And it's a more realistic picture of, okay, well, whether you're middle class or not. And that Pew Research Center calculator is a lifesaver because it will take a bunch of different factors, bring them all together, and then give you the answer. Now, that's what we're going to use for a definition from middle class. Now, on to the working class definition. Now, the two are often used interchangeably, but I would tell you today that I don't believe the two are the same thing. In fact, I don't think that they could be any more different. Now, just like middle class, working class also has two definitions. The first one happens to be cultural, however. The second one's financial, and we're going to explore them both. Now, the cultural component is simply saying I'm a working class member. I work with my hands, or if you prefer, I wear a quote unquote blue collar. I have a blue collar job. I don't go to an office. I don't sit behind a desk all day or something to that effect. And that's the cultural proponent of what it means to be a quote unquote working class member. There is a problem with using that definition, though. Number one, it's not going to fit our versus category because it doesn't dive into the financial. But the second thing is that it used to be used as an insult. Nowadays, people wear it like a badge of honor. And as far as I'm concerned, that's been a long time coming. We have had a love affair with the white-collar world for at least 4 decades. That has produced one of the largest and immense skilled trade shortages that you could find. And now we're reaping what we've sowed. It's time to pay the piper, as it were. And for 4 decades, what we have consistently told people is that you don't need to work with your hands and you shouldn't want to work with your hands. You want to work with your head. The future's on the internet, the future's with computers, etc. We're stigmatizing the trades to the degree that we've done. And now what we are seeing now is the shortage is so severe, if you will, or at least it's exacerbated to a degree with all of the people who are retiring and the age gap that we're seeing, is that a flop, which again, like I said, I am pleased to see, and we should have seen this a long time ago. I'm very proud of this. People are wearing the fact that they are blue-collar workmen out in the field. They're wearing it like a badge of honor, and they should, because those jobs in many, many ways are far more important than a lot of office jobs. However, as culturally significant as that turns out to be, that's actually not the definition we're going to use. What we are going to use is the financial definition for working class. We're going to use the street.com's definition, and I'll link that into the description. But they say, quote, instead, for those of us in economic policy, working class has come to fill in the bottom section of the middle class. As Gallup's Frank Newport describes it, it is a socioeconomic positioning that is below that of what is associated with the middle class, but above that which is associated with the lower class or the poor, end quote. In other words, you are considered working class when you are not part of the middle class. You are lower, but you are not part of the poor. That's a good distinction to make. In other words, let me break this down for you even further past thestreet.com's definition, which is a good definition, by the way. When you are a working class member, you are not considered part of the middle class. You are actually below the middle class. A lot of people think that we've got the middle class and we break the middle class up. Upper middle class, lower middle class. No. You have middle class, and then it doesn't just go middle class poor. It's middle class, working class, and then the poor. And the major distinction and the major driver here is when you can be considered middle class. Now, I gave you the definitions, but when you can truly be considered middle class, for the most part, is going to be whether or not you have discretionary or free spending. Meaning, I've paid all my bills. Ideally, I should be saving for retirement, whether it's in an IRA or even better, if you have a collective bargaining agreement and it is contractually obligated. But you've got retirement, you've got all the necessities, if you will, taken care of, and now you have extra money left over to do something. It could be a family membership at the YMCA. It could be tickets to the theme park down the road. Whatever your kicks are for you and your family, if you've got extra money to that degree, then you're going to be able to be considered middle class. The working class are not that way. The working class members are the ones who, let's say, do not fall below the poverty line, where there might be a social safety net to help you out, but you're not thriving either. These are the people whose heads are just above water, and they're treading water, and they always feel like they're just about to drown. They live paycheck to paycheck. All of their income goes to basic necessities, and that's it. Those people are the working class, and the middle class individuals have some extra money to enjoy or to free spend, if you will, discretionary spending. Now, before we continue on, there is one little caveat I want to make sure we cover in this podcast episode. When I talk about all of my income is devoted to necessities. And that's the word I want to focus in on, necessity. You could not claim, because some people do, we enjoy being martyrs if we're honest. In a lot of ways, a lot of us would say, well, I'm working class because every single dollar I make is also spoken for. But here's what I mean when I say your necessities. Your mortgage or your rent, the food that you need to consume, the utilities that you're going to have on in your house. And that's essentially it. We're not talking about having to have cable. We're not talking about having to have a phone, even though many people in the working class and middle class and even poor, for that matter, have a phone in this country. I'm not talking about having to have streaming platforms or what's more likely to be the case, large car payments. I'm not talking about that either, because those are not necessities. So what I mean is, if all of your paycheck is being consumed, you're going to have to spend your money on paying bills, and you don't have any free money, you can't rightly say you're a working class member if, let's say, for example, $1,000 a month is eat away in car payments. You don't have to have $1,000 a month in car payments. In fact, many people don't even have a car in the first place. They use public transportation and the like to get back and forth. Those people, the people who are legitimately working class, head just above water, barely make enough to pay for their necessities, and that's it. They are the ones who are actually classified as working class. The rest of us might feel like that, but actually we're middle class. And I promise you there's a reason why I'm making this distinction and talking about this caveat. We'll get to it. But the reality is a lot of us would claim, well, I'm one working stiff to another, and I'm just a working class guy that I'm paying all my bills and all my money is going to my bills. Yes, some of it is for necessities and some of it is for our wants and not our needs. We would do well to remember that when we're amassing data and we're looking at various things, we want an accurate picture of who actually constitutes the middle class and who constitutes the working class, so that policies from a governmental perspective or any kind of socioeconomic change that would come out even from the people within, the better the accurate picture of where people stand, the more likely we are to actually be effective in what we're looking to do. If we're operating on bad data just because somebody wants to say they're working class, it does us no good. Which should lead us into, how many Americans are working class? It's a good question. This depends on who you ask. If you just generally Google it, you're going to find numbers that are all over the map, if you will. And one of the primary reasons for that is because we have a definition that is very ambiguous out there in the real world. For example, when you look at it, Forbes has an article that's also, I will link this into the description, but Forbes cites payroll.org, and payroll says 78% of Americans are working class, or if you will, live paycheck to paycheck. Market Watch says it's 66.2%. CNBC via Survey Monkey say it's 65%. And then you look at Bankrate, and Bankrate says it's 34%. 34% is still 34% too many. Now, if you are considered, quote unquote, a working class member because all of your money is going to needs and wants, then you can't really say that you're a working class member. But if you are just barely keeping your head above water, then working class is where you're at, and working class is where we shouldn't be. Not because of wants, but just simply because of needs. That's a problem in America today. So the next question that I want to talk about or explore, how did it get this way? How do we go from having what we call the Great Prosperity, an era that we saw unprecedented economic growth, that was far more equitable across the board, where the average individual got their due, when they were producing in the economy, as opposed to now where we have this growing, if you will, gulf. Well, there's two things. This tells me one of two things. Both of them, I believe, are happening at the same time. Number one, more Americans are falling from middle class to working class. This could be for a number of reasons, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. But the Pew Research Center talks about this, and they say, quote, "The growth in income in recent decades has tilted to upper income households. At the same time, the U.S. middle class, which once comprised the clear majority of Americans, is shrinking. Thus, a greater share of the nation's aggregate income is now going to upper income households, and the share going to middle and lower income households is falling. The share of American adults who live in middle income households has decreased from 61% in 1971 to 51% in 2019. This downsizing has proceeded slowly but surely since 1971, with each decade thereafter typically ending with a smaller share of adults living in middle-income households than at the beginning of the decade." End quote. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. A lot of it has added its feet for globalization and the manufacturing offshoring taking place and the like. And of course, if you will, the weaponization of labor law, or weakening the labor law and weaponizing to the degree lobbyists who can weaken labor law, the erosion of unions. By and large, unionism, the decline in unionism, is commensurate or equal to the decline of the middle class. When charted together, you will see that they both go down at the same time. And in 1971, we began to just see the rumblings of more aggressive anyway, offshoring, globalization, etc., that has precipitated and especially ramped up in the 80s and onward, of course, till today. So the first part is we see Americans, if you will, coming from the middle class and descending into the working class. But the second part of this, and it's a double whammy, and we got it coming from both ends, is that there is a whole lot of people who are coming into adulthood and are never even making it out of working class. They're never rising to middle class. They're staying right there at working class. If you think about it, I have been continually talking about individuals who are taking on college loans that have grown exponentially over the past 20 years for it, following the mantra that you got to go to college to get a good job. And then when they enter into adulthood, not only do they not know what they want to do for a living, but they're also saddled with enormous amounts of debt around their neck. And from a cultural perspective, we had lied to them. And because we want that money from a culture, we're going to get you to go into the educational component in the system. We're going to, just bring you on in, teach you whatever it is that we think that you need to know to go out into the workforce, when in reality it's not true at all. Then you enter into adulthood and you don't know what you want to do. You have all this debt and you have to pay it back. You have to pay it back. And for years, and some people for decades, you have this enormous debt payment that you have to pay off. And that keeps you at the working class level. And you never really rise then to the middle class. And so when you have people descending from the middle class into working class, and you have people that never actually make it to middle class, is it any wonder then that the middle class is shrinking? No. The reality is the income inequality gulf that is growing exponentially is revealing a systemic problem that we have, and weak and ineffective labor law and exploitation that's certainly taken place. And if this sounds eerily similar to where we were at 120 years ago, then I would say that you have perspective, because that's exactly what's taking place. 120 years ago, there were no weekends, there was no overtime, there was no 40-hour work week. You got paid with company paper, and you shopped in company stores, and you lived in company housing, and you worked, and your kids worked, and you were effectively working class, which is why that specific era is called the Gilded Age or the Robber Baron Age. You had the haves and the have-nots. There was no middle class. You either had a lot of money or you were poor. And then unionization began to take front because people wanted more. They wanted better for their kids. They wanted their kids to be able to go and actually be a kid and not have to go to work and not have to toil away, robbing them of their childhood just to make somebody more money. And I might add, just to help them pay the bills. And then organized labor came up, took on that fight, won numerous concessions, and the middle class began to grow exponentially. And what did we see then? In the 70s, the pendulum with globalization, anti-union talk and rhetoric, the pendulum began to swing the other way, and we see a diminishing middle class, diminishing unionism, and an income inequality gulf that continues to grow today, with less Americans as middle class and more of them in the working class. So if this looks like then a quasi return to what it was like 120 years ago, with a few tweaks and changes, making it seem like, well, that's your house, but I'm not going to pay you enough, or you're not going to have enough money, if you will, to have discretionary spending, and you're right. That's exactly what it looks like, because that's what's taking place. And which brings us then to the last point, which is exploring options to address this trend. It is no secret that you are seeing populism on the rise. Populism has been rising for at least the past 5 years. It's got some rumblings in the past decade or two, but it certainly has a lot of rumblings, most especially since the pandemic, because people feel like they're being squeezed to death. You can only squeeze a turnip so much. You can't get blood from a turnip, if you will, and people are being squeezed. And so populism then is on the rise. And one of the reasons why it is the way it is because governmental law to a significant degree is continually being challenged in the court system and is continually being undermined. Just the other day, I was reading a headline. It was yesterday. The FTC and their ban on non-competes has been halted. Don't know when, how long this is going to be. We don't know how long it will take to navigate through the court system to finally get a legitimate answer. This may even go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Who knows? You also have the overtime availability for salary workers increased, and it's being challenged. The Chevron structure has been overturned. All of these things are coming together, and what you are effectively seeing is government's attempt to look out for working class people from a cultural perspective, not the financial definition, but working people in general, everyday Americans, that is continually being undermined. So the reason that populism is gaining is because people are losing trust. People are losing trust in government and its ability to get things done. In the end, corporations have too much money, lobby too many people to make any effective change from a governmental perspective. So populism is on the rise, and rightly so. The other thing that you're starting to see in an attempt to address this trend that most people they know it's going on, but they haven't put their finger on it and been able to go, that's exactly what's taking place. I'm not middle class anymore. I'm working class. They don't think about these things. All they think about is the fact that I have barely enough money to keep myself afloat. I'm tired of this. It's ridiculous. It's a problem, and populism begins to swell. And right alongside it is a significant uptick in increased interest in organized labor or unions. 2022, the very end of 2022, we began to see a significant uptick in organized labor's popularity, and it carried us through 2023, and it is carrying us through 2024 as well. It is a telling thing when some conservative politicians, whether they're blowing smoke or not, acknowledge, if you will, the fact that we've got a systemic problem when it comes to power and pay and the things from a worker's perspective, as well as economists who sit here and say, like Angus Deaton, who come around and say, we have a problem and unions are needed today. I have changed my mind because of what I have seen. So populism then and organized labor at this point, at this juncture, are the only effective weapons that regular everyday Americans have to begin addressing this phenomenon of middle class decline and working class growth. That's it. As I've said, multiple podcast episodes and even talked about it in multiple articles, not even governmental law, some of which has been codified for decades, is safe. But people will put up with what people will put up with. And then you get to a point where people will put up with no more. And if we want to see a continual growing working class and a continual dwindling of the middle class, then all we have to do is keep on doing what we've been doing, which is nothing, which is letting corporations run roughshod, have all the power, continue to lobby, or from a populist perspective, we can watch organized labor and work with organized labor and help organized labor grow and represent people and bring people together, throw back to what is a union, bringing people together, and let that be an effective weapon and a force for change. Because the middle class is dwindling and the working class is on the rise. And that is why this podcast episode, has come about, is because I wanted to explore it and say, this is what's taking place. You see it. You've experienced it. Chances are you know many, many people that fit in these niches, whether they're middle class or you've seen a number of relatives or friends or neighbors or whatever effectively become working class, but just never had somebody articulate it to the degree that you went, that's what's happening. I can't put my finger on it, but that's what's happening until this podcast episode here. We are seeing the rights and the privileges of working everyday Americans be squeezed and taken away and dwindled to the fact that now we have a growing working class and a dwindling middle class. And that's this podcast episode in a nutshell. middle class versus working class. If you like this podcast episode, leave me a like and a comment, share it out. But more people need to be made aware of the systemic problem that we've got. Thanks for listening. I'll see you on the next one.